And again, I will join here with my own thanks to all organizers, to the readers of my work, to those who technically support this presentation and will need for interpretation that will happen. And I'm really grateful, and normally I would say that I'm happy to talk to the audiences of attentive listeners. It's just so difficult to speak about happiness, as you understand in the moment, and the conversation will be about a very horrid topic today. So the title of presentation, as you already know, Russian war in Ukraine, energy terrorism, cyber war, and atmoterrorism. As I was in Ukraine for last year and a half, I was doing a lot of media interviews for world channels from different countries. And probably because of my specialization, I was always asked to talk about disinformation. Russian disinformation, its power, and how it could have led to the war. And as I was giving my comments and opinions on the topic of disinformation, I've noticed a very serious qualitative shift indicating the transition from disinformation practices of deception as part of information and cyber warfare to the strategic production of terror. I'm waiting for the slides. A little pause. Okay. A premeditated and unlawful act of terrorism committed either by rebels or governments can be isolated, but it can also take part in the context of war. In this case, it also should be distinguished as such. As historian Charles Townshend writes, clearly, war and terror are intimately related. However, the essence of terrorism, in contrast to war, he explains, is surely the negation of combat. Its targets are attacked in a way that inhibits, or better prohibits, self-defense, end quote. As I've been looking at different isolated yet systemic acts of terror during the ongoing war of Russia in Ukraine, I understood that these acts of terror should be approached environmentally. That is to say, with the consideration of all connections and relations that they impact and destroy, and also infrastructures that make these acts of terror possible. The terror environments of this war are characterized by simultaneous targeting of Ukraine's population by weapon and by information. And this strategy can be associated with the names of at least two commanders of all Russian forces in Ukraine, General Sergei Surovikin and General Valery Gerasimov, both now dismissed. It was expected that General Surovikin, who oversaw the bombardment of Aleppo in 2016, when Syrian government forces retook the city, would apply the same methods of carpet bombing and burned ass policy as a military strategy that aims to destroy anything that might be useful to the enemy, which he did from the day one of his new appointment, and the massive bombing of Kyiv and many other Ukrainian cities and villages in mid-October last year as his inaugural military act. General Gerasimov had been around for a while. Back in 2013, he delivered a speech to a Russian military conference that analyzed a very useful American contemporary warfare, hybrid, non-linear warfare for gray zone conflict. It was published in an obscure journal called the Military Industrial Courier. It became known as Gerasimov Doctrine. Or it would be fair to say it was actually Keith Alexander or NSA Doctrine, because it was, of course, stolen from them. So again, the terror environment is produced by double targeting of civilian population by weapons and by information. But let's look at the notion environment. Historically, and this is of course Western notions, conceived in the frameworks of European post-Enlightenment, the environment of European modernity. It's been around since the end of the 18th century, and it bears directly upon the rethinking of the conventional divide between nature and culture. It seems fitting that the word environment would first appear in the modern sense in 1828, at the dawn of the era that would produce the factory town and the railroad, high-speed industrialization, the extensive mapping and extraction of natural resources, and the intensive use of fossil fuel, all of which the observable signs of the Anthropocene. For Scottish historian, critic, and sociological writer Thomas Carlyle, environment is a counter-enlightenment notion that against the division between nature and culture conveys a holistic approach. It speaks about porous and shifting boundaries of the self and its connection with the surrounding, which could be physical, social, intellectual, or spiritual. For English philosopher, physiologist, biologist, anthropologist, and sociologist Herbert Spencer, environment was not only about physical or biological factors, but social and political ones. He wrote about the concealment of the different elements that make up the world outside the organism and the relations between these elements. So the notion of environment both reflected and helped generate the new conceptual possibilities for ecological thinking. At the same time, it had an immense impact on the strategies and tactics of war making in the 20th and 21st century. 2 decades ago, German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk proposed that the discovery of the environment took place in the trenches of World War I. He referred to the practices of deployed gas as a weapon during the war, first by France using of tear gas in August 1914, and then by Germany in April 1915, under the curation of German chemist, a winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, Fritz Haber, who was the head of the German gas warfare program. And it was under the curation of Germans Chlorine was first used in war. And here you're looking at the aerial photograph from that time of how wind-swept gas spreads across the battlefield in Europe, which demonstrates that the environmental awareness came so handy for the engineers of gas warfare to target masses of soldiers by destroying what Spencer described as concealed assemblages, relations, and processes, all the elements of life-supporting bioinfrastructures in the world outside the organism. The photograph also demonstrates that gas warfare was synchronous with reimagining the battlefield from the aerial point of view, up above, that is now known as drone vision. Sloterdijk also uses another description, which I appreciate more. He speaks about ecologized wars with the emphasis on relations as an object for weaponization and a target for destruction. In the 20th century, Sloterdijk projects, will be remembered as the age whose essential thought consisted in targeting no longer the body, but the enemy's environment, the immediate atmospheric envelope. Since air and atmosphere are the primary media for life, he writes, the primary target for destruction becomes the air milieu in which enemy bodies move, subject to their own breathing reflex, end quote. Thinking war environmentally becomes typical for all the wars of modernity. It constitutes the continuity between the 20th and 21st century wars, as it is clearly seen in the current war in Ukraine, that has accumulated tactics and strategies of both World War I and World War II. It is at the same time a trench and artillery war and an aircraft war. Computation is merged with anti-aircraft fire. Battlefield strategies are assisted by probabilistic calculations. This is also a cyber war, which, apart from the kinetic use of helicopters, artillery, rocket batteries, tanks, small arms, and other conventional weapons, also involves electronic command, control, communication, and weapons of targeting systems. All of this is now amplified by signal and open source intelligence, aerial and ground-based intelligence, monitoring and analysis of social networks, with or without special software. Ongoing cyber attacks and hacks have been consistent with conventional definitions of cyber war, but the present conflict also marked a turning point for pilotless aircraft. This development takes the notion of cyber war to another level. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces employ drones for surveillance, correcting artillery fire, dropping weapons, jamming local cell phone towers, and sending threatening messages to enemy soldiers, known as SMS bombing. Apart from their extensive application on the battlefield, the Russian army has used drone targeting to terrorize and bomb civilians. And here the Russian state explores the grimmest legacy of the US war on terror. The notion of terror environment helps understanding the interconnectedness of all elements of this complex composition and its materiality, its density, and if you wish, where various matters from radio frequencies to phosphorus, electricity, to radiation converge. And here you see the use of phosphorus by the Russian forces in Donbass in May last year. And next slide shows the use of phosphorus over the city of Irpin in Ukraine in summer. Next slide. In the following, I will briefly focus on three instances that present certain new developments worth our attention. First, the atmoterrorist model at work during the Russia-Ukraine war and its nuclear dimension. At the very outset of the full-scale invasion, we witnessed an unprecedented military occupation of nuclear power plants. Initially, within first hours of the invasion, Russian forces entered the territory of the former Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is now a state-run specialized enterprise for decommissioning the Chernobyl nuclear power plant units. Then, a month later, they occupied the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This became the center of an ongoing international nuclear safety crisis, more accurately described as an act of nuclear terrorism. The act of terrorism here concerns not only the torture of the workers or the presence of heavy military vehicles in a close proximity to the nuclear reactors and the containers with worked fuel, but also the acts of disconnection of the plants from the international monitoring system, which such weaponization of the nuclear power plants allows to identify this war not just as cyber war, but nuclear cyber war. The Chernobyl zone of exclusion is one of the modern wastelands that does, I argue, demonstrate the modern logic of radioactive colonialism. A British post-colonial theorist and historian, Robert Young, writes, transformed by force, the colony could also become a laboratory for experiment for new technology and new ways of thinking, which makes a colony a laboratory of modernity, which I'm saying that Chernobyl zone is. This makes me disagree with the Russian cultural theorist Alexander Etkin, who in his recent book describing Russia, the aggressor in the imperial war against Ukraine, as acting against modernity. Instead, I argue, by mobilizing the imperial and colonial legacies embodied in its regime for the war in Ukraine, a heir of the Russian Empire, the Russian Federation, acts exactly as an agent of modernity, a modern imperial state with unstable borders and always ready for violent expansion for the sake of expansion, and not just against modernity. The production of the Chernobyl zone of exclusion approach through the framework of critical colonial and imperial studies elucidates the continuity between the Soviet colonial practices of wastelanding and the ongoing war of aggression, both essentially modern in their imperial design, where unlimited expansion by means of colonial war and unlimited extraction of natural resources on the infrastructurally and military subsumed lands are the cooperative mechanisms. The Soviet activities in the area also demonstrated a crucial for modernity merge of peace and war, civilian peaceful atom and military grade plutonium productions. So civilian and military technologies, regimes, and industries converged there. Wastelanding of Ukrainian Polissa, the name of that region, where the Chernobyl zone is located now, demonstrates the specifics of colonial relation between the Russian metropolis and the Ukrainian rural area. Soviet prominent physicist and one of the leaders of the Soviet atomic project, Anatoly Alexandrov, a president of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR, who worked with Soviet physicist Igor Kurchatov, director of the former Soviet program of nuclear weapons, was known for saying that the graphite moderated nuclear power reactors of his design, RBMK, do not explode and were safe enough to be installed even on Red Square in Moscow. Instead, the Soviet government installed them 140 kilometers away from Kiev in the forestry area of Polissa, forever impacting the traditional life in the area, turned into a polygon of this Cold War contestation with the West. So here you see the map of the Chernobyl zone, and this initial circle, it's a kind of the shows the strategy and the planning around where the population had to be removed. But in fact, I'm saying that the zone was produced not by the explosion itself, by the location of these two military objects. One, the radar Duga for detecting American ballistic rockets, known as Russian woodpecker, because it was caught all the time in civilian radio frequencies. And so people everywhere, especially in the UK and in the USA, would hear on the civilian radio frequency a kind of the sound of knocking, as even it's a woodpecker kind of makes. And then the nuclear power state as well. So presence of these two Cold War objects, in fact, created the securitization and militarization of the zone before the explosion. That's kind of my major argument in my recent research. The Soviet rule in Polissa also demonstrates the characteristic of another type of colony, not just resource-oriented, but, as Jan mentions, garrison. A traditional garrison colony, as dictionary tells us, is a place in which troops are quartered for defensive or other military purposes in a particular location, originally to guard it. The term is also applied to certain facilities that constitute a military base or fortified military headquarters. So I argue that the city of Chernobyl and the securitized and militarized territory around it, including the city of Pripyat, founded on February 4th, 1970, to serve the future nuclear power plant as the 9th Soviet Atomgrad, a closed city, was a garrison colony of the Soviet military-industrial complex on the territory of Ukraine. And so this tells us about non-accidental terrorism and non-accidental Chernobyl zone that has a longer history, and this history has to be excavated. And so it also demonstrates this imperialist genealogy carried out during the Russia-Ukraine war. Second thing I want to point out, speaking about the environmental war, we need to talk about pollution as a weapon of war, not a side effect, as an essential, but an essential component of the war. In one of such instances, a satellite image produced by Maxar Technologies in the end of May last year was analyzed by the Ukrainian Nature Conservation Group. And this is an old example, of course, but I want to use it because it's still very good. It shows how much we can learn from the satellite imagery and how much damage is visible already and was visible more than a year ago. So this image captures the Izum district of the Kharkiv region, where heavy military action was ongoing. And they counted, the scholars counted 480 funnel-shaped holes, which suggests that there could be about 50 tons of iron, 1 ton of sulfur compounds, and 2.35 tons of copper entered the soil in this square kilometer of the field. These explosions, the expert concluded, uprooted at least 90,000 tons of soil. This ecosystem is already severely damaged and will require a long time to recover, provided it doesn't suffer irreversible erosion after the upper level of soil loses its fertility, releasing the organic matter into the atmosphere. What remains invisible, though, and thus unavailable for evaluation, is the reportedly rather high number of undetonated shells that are stuck in the soil. An estimate is 3 to 30% of those that are there. These constitute a delayed form of damage, a fault in the complex temporality of the ecocidal trauma of war in Ukraine. In January 2023, it was reported that Ukraine became the most mined country in the world. Now more than 40% of the territories of Ukraine are mined, 250,000 square kilometers. And then, of course, there was Kakhovka, the explosion of the Kakhovka Dam on June 6 this summer. And the consequences of it you see on this slide. So if with the field I was speaking about a kind of a slow ecocide, now after this explosion, we already see a very different type of ecocide happening there. After my communications with many experts who are dealing with ecocide scholarly, but also as activists and lobbyists, there is a precedent now, and I hope it will work, that the International Court would consider would consider ecocide as a fifth crime of war, because so far it's not a crime. And then if such law would be changed, so it could be changed using the precedent of Kakhovka Dam, so we can bring the responsible to justice. And now next slide. And the third point I want to make in this presentation, and it concerns the acts of extreme violence, video recorded and circulated via social networks sometimes showing the beheading of a screaming soldier in the uniform of National Guard of Ukraine. Other times, Ukrainian left human rights activists interrogation where he is presented as a Nazi, cutting off genitals of people, soldiers in the war, rape of children, and all these videos, of course, circulated through various shady and not so shady media channels. I constantly think about the nature of this extreme violence and its roots, its origin. Does it have anything to do with the constant encouragement to kill, to drown, to erase, to strike on that we hear on Russian state TV? Or such texts as, for example, notorious essay by Russian politician Sergeytsev in March last year, known under the title, What Russia Should Do with Ukraine. Or with a priest also broadcasted on Russian state TV saying that Ukrainians should have their throats cut according to the Old Testament. So what is that reason? What is that trigger? What pushes people kind of commit this violence? And when I think about what this media environment, where all these clips are being circulated, well, all these narratives are being said, this is when I am saying that it's not information war as we once knew it, because it's not just about lies. It has to do with something else. And we need to recognize this as a qualitative shift from disinformation practices to the strategic production of terror. And this is why I call it the terror environment. And we can go to next slide. And the terror environment is located in the gap between political understanding of genocide and crimes against humanity and the legal interpretation, especially when it comes to genocidal speech, for which you cannot or almost cannot find the speaker accountable in court, because it is extremely difficult to prove that one's intention or the direct relation between the call to kill and actual killing. New methodologies are being invented as we speak to actually see or find out or determine this relation. The Ukrainian governmental Center Against Disinformation has been collecting data and mapping the relation. So they say between the calls to kill and the events on the ground. So they are working on such methodology, although it's still non-existent. They say they find correlation that can be used in court. And we do have such precedents in history. For example, in genocide in Rwanda, when certain calls on radio, in fact, were put in relation with genocide and someone was brought to court. So there is a historical and legal precedent when it worked in court, but we're not sure whether it would work in the case of Ukraine war. Hopefully it will. But how we indeed do it to make kind of useful in court, it's not really clear now. The Russian government justified the full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a necessary state of exception, also called special operation. It remains illegal to call it war with all those mobilizations. A state of exception designates warfare without clear definition, employing unconventional techniques. In this regard, The Russian state description of this war as a special operation is accurate. It describes their intention of transgressing the laws of war by opening space for unregulated war crimes, for creating multiple terror environments marked by extreme suppression and violence. In here, I would just make a little comment on that. So we still, of course, it's absolutely important to call it war, because when we call it war, and when it is war, right? So this thing as war allows to bring someone for war crimes in the international court. So that's why war is an important term. But if we want theoretically to think about kind of this transgression against any rules of war, although, of course, it can be said that all rules or many rules are always transgressed in war. So then there is this awkward term of special operation. It's almost an open declaration of transgression of all rules, possibility of all sort of violence and stuff like that. Terror environments are centered around necropolitical data subjects, simultaneously surveilled and threatened on the ground and from above by the assemblage of military and commercial technologies, distinguishing between which has become irrelevant during recent wars. The colonial imperial vector of the Russian war in Ukraine is explicit in the southeast. Although there were torture rooms and filtration facilities before the invasion, they go back to 2014, as well as the instances of deportation of Ukrainian population to Russia, which indicated the beginning of the war for me. After the full-scale invasion, they became massive. In December 2022, the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine reported 54 torture chambers discovered in the deoccupied territories, and more than 5,000 cases of torture were recorded. And of course, we can imagine that many people do not speak about these experiences because they are extreme to the point of, complete subjective collapse. So here is from the report by Mobile Justice Team from March this year, and I quote, "Evidence has been collected from over 1,000 torture chamber survivors in Kherson with physical beating, electric shock torture, and waterboarding among common criminal acts used against Ukrainian women and men held in Kherson in the effort to eliminate resistance to the occupation. Pro-Russian slogans, poems, and songs were discovered on cell walls, which prisoners were forced to learn and recite. Over 400 people are also reported to have vanished from Kherson torture centers, and it remains unknown whether they have been killed or taken to Russia-held territories. I propose to distinguish at least two vectors of aggressive blackmail that also includes nuclear blackmail as a shaper for a broader context of terror that also reveal the overdetermined nature of the ongoing war. One vector is inter-imperial, and it concerns the aggressive processes of redistribution of power between several major players of the international politics and economy. Another vector is colonial it concerns the imperial relation of the Russian Federation towards Ukraine. Here, the inter-imperial communication unfolds according to the logic of deterrence, understood as a threat or force applied by one party to convince another party to refrain from initiating a particular course of action. While it is extremely aggressive, it is still a communicative exchange. Only the part that nuclear weapons play in such exchange has nothing to do with restraint, as we knew from the Cold War, as it was previously assumed, but instead it has to do with acceleration. The critics of such communication, the circles of such communication, understood broadly to include various political economic transactions, should not break. The system survives for rebooting itself, even if it's significantly transformed in the process. So the capitalist circles, the capitalist inter-imperial communication operated by the logic of deterrence should run and will run. That's why they say that sanctions do not work very well, really, and always there are ways to evade them. The colonial imperial vector is the trajectory of non-communication. It sets the direction for the relation of suppression, subsumption, annihilation, and erasure. All negotiations are suspended indefinitely. Ukraine does not exist, we are told. The colonial imperial vector sets the process to make this claim a reality, even if after the fact of annunciation. Thank you. This is the end of my talk.